It is Christmas of 1920, and J.r.r. Tolkien's eldest son, John, who was only 3 years old at the time, wakes up to find a peculiar-looking envelope. The envelope has stamps that the young boy had never seen before, and they seem to have originated from the North Pole. Upon opening the envelope, the young boy finds on one side a letter dated to December 22nd, 1920, from Christmas House in the North Pole, and written by Father Christmas himself. Within the letter, Father Christmas claims to have heard about the young John's curiosity about him, so he had to write a letter to answer the boy's questions and tell him about the status of his Christmas presents. On the other side of the letter are two beautiful drawings, one of Father Christmas himself and the other of Christmas House. This was the very first letter written by J.r.r. Tolkien to his children under the identity of Father Christmas himself, starting a tradition within the Tolkien family in which Tolkien would write for his children a letter from Father Christmas and his helpers annually for over 20 years, from 1920 to 1943. What started as Father Christmas telling the 3-year-old John of the North Pole and his travels developed into a story that grew in scale each year, filled with new creatures, languages, enemies and friends, of beautiful illustrations and an ever-expanding world. Does this remind you of anything? In this video, I will show you how a loving Christmas tradition between a father and his children influenced the development of the Lord of the Rings. Beyond the custom stamps from the North Pole that cost 2 kisses, or the fact that Tolkien had convinced the local postman to deliver the letters himself for some added realism, Tolkien went to great lengths in order to create a consistent and realistic narrative within the otherwise fantastical adventures of Father Christmas. He developed a specific handwriting for him, as well as different mannerisms or phrases that only he would use. Even from the earliest letters, whenever in the narrative the North Pole was experiencing particularly cold weather, or there was some problem with the heating, Christmas's handwriting would always be different, less understandable, and that resembled more of a scribble, as his hands were cold and he was so old it was becoming difficult for him to write so well. Though in the very early years, the narratives of the letters would not go much beyond Father Christmas greeting the children, by 1925 they started getting bigger. He introduced the North Polar Bear, Santa's fantastical helper that would often get into trouble, such as causing Father Christmas to change addresses, moving from Christmas House to Cliff House, following an unfortunate incident that led to the former's destruction. Moreover, the polar bear began making additions to the letters, which most importantly had their own unique way of speaking as well as writing. By the next year, in 1926, in the letters we see something that would often occur within the Legendarium and the Lord of the Rings. In a letter describing North Polar Bear's misadventures, Tolkien explains the phenomenon of the Northern Lights within the context of the fantasy he had created, as them merely being the result of Father Christmas's firecrackers that only he uses on special occasions such as Christmas, with them being turned on or off with a tap in his basement. From this we can see the influences on Tolkien's other works when explaining nature, such as the origins of the sun and the moon of the Lord of the Rings, which are in fact guided in the sky by their guardian spirits within mighty vessels. The letters continued for the next few years in a similar fashion. They were filled with humor and fun interactions between the different characters, all writing on top of each other on the same letters and engaging in friendly banter. And the letters were usually connected to the children's own lives, in which Father Christmas and his friends would ask questions about a variety of life events or family developments, all in their own unique way. An incredible development took place in November of 1929, in a letter written by the polar bear. Within it, the bear reveals its real name, Karhu, a Finnish word, but most importantly, the bear tells the children of its native language, Arctic, which is in fact one of the earliest examples of the Quenya language spoken by the elves of the Lord of the Rings, and written in a familiar runic script. By 1929, we're also introduced to actual elves for the very first time, the Snow Elves, who are dressed in white and blend in with the snow. And in the following years, we're also introduced to the Green and Red Elves, the latter also known as Red Gnomes. These elves seem to have been directly connected with Tolkien's original drafts of his world, with the Red Elves especially much resembling the Noldor Elves. One of the most important events that ties the Lord of the Rings with the letters of Father Christmas took place on December 23, 1932, in which we're introduced to the goblins. In that and the letters that followed, we learn that the goblins are the ancient enemies of Father Christmas and his friends, including the elves. Throughout the following letters, we are told of their long wars and bloody battles from the past, and especially during the years leading into the Second World War and his children's coming of age, when the mood of the letters begins to change accordingly. In addition to the introduction of the goblins, these creatures that would eventually become the orcs of the Lord of the Rings, we also get a glimpse of their language and most importantly their writing system, with Tolkien further embellishing this world that he had created. In 1937, we're also properly introduced to Father Christmas's secretary, Ilbereth, who is described as one of the cleverest elves. And in that year's letter, he writes in what is one of the first appearances of the Elvish script used in The Lord of the Rings, Tengwar, which was made by Fëanor himself, the creator of the Silmarils. With the start of the Second World War in 1939, Father Christmas himself makes references to the conflict, concerned about the well-being of the people and especially the children of the world, and above all hoping to see it end soon. By that point, the children have all mostly grown up, and they have scarcely replied to any of Father Christmas's letters, with only Tolkien's youngest child and only daughter Priscilla remaining. In those very last letters that coincided with the war, Tolkien, through his characters, makes sure to address the concerns of his daughter and teach her about what is happening in the world in a way more fitting for a child, while also attempting to lift her spirits up and give her hope during those hard times. He draws her penguins and does his very best to create more light-hearted stories in his typical style, but his Priscilla too must grow. It is unavoidable. In Christmas of 1943, after over 20 years of this beautiful tradition, Father Christmas sends his final letter. My dear Priscilla, a very happy Christmas. I suppose you will be hanging up your stockings just once more. I hope so, for I have still a few little things for you. After this, I shall have to say goodbye, more or less. I mean, I shall not forget you. We always keep the old numbers of our friends and their letters. And later on we hope to come back when they are grown up and have houses of their own and children. My messengers tell me that people call it grim this year. I think they mean miserable. And so it is, I fear, in very many places where I was especially fond of going. But I am very glad to hear that you are still not really miserable. Don't be. I am still very much alive and shall come back again soon, as merry as ever. Through the hardships experienced by the characters, we also see the beginning of one of the most important themes within the philosophy of The Lord of the Rings, which is that of hope. We see the development of our heroes on an emotional level, through the adventures that they experience. We see their bonds get stronger, and a fellowship of sorts begins to grow. Beyond the introduction of some of Tolkien's most iconic creations with his languages and creatures, we also see the spirit of adventure. We see what it is to go on a quest with those that you love, and that love you, and creating memories together, making the world a better place. Almost every year, Father Christmas faced a new challenge that hindered his ability to deliver presents to the world's children, but through the help of his friends, he managed to succeed. Nonetheless, despite their incredible humor and whimsical nature, the letters are in their core bittersweet. The children are growing up. They don't like the fantastical anymore. They don't believe in it. Each Christmas is less magical than the last, and Tolkien tries his best to make each letter more elaborate, attempting to keep it alive for just a year longer. He knows very well, however, that this is not how things are. Kids grow up, but perhaps they will have kids of their own one day, and maybe they'll become Father Christmas themselves. It is both sad and wonderful for a parent to see their children grow up, but it is something that they must accept, as Father Christmas did. Things change, and maybe they're changing too fast and we don't like it, but there's nothing we can do about it, other than keep going. The elves of Middle-earth would fade, and the magic of the world would be lost. The age of men would begin, and they would no longer be as they were. That is how things are. What it ultimately comes down to is how the elves will react. Some will sail west and remain there until the remaking of the world, while others will stay in Middle-earth and slowly fade. Things cannot stay the same, regardless of how much we want them to. Despite this, as Father Christmas said, this does not mean that we need to forget, nor does it mean that we have not gained from all of the experiences that have come before. These core values that grew out of a father's deep love for his family in the span of over 2 decades are values that he kept close to his heart while writing The Lord of the Rings. And while reading each letter, you get a better understanding of Tolkien the writer, who above all else was Tolkien the father. Thank you very much for watching, and Merry Christmas to you all.